Well, thanks for having me. Thanks for inviting me here. I will start by saying that I'm obviously not a biologist. I really enjoyed learning things this morning. As I'm giving my talk, when I first saw the agenda, I did try to adapt it, realizing that the audience is not earth scientists. I'll make some more tweaks along the way after having seen the talks in the morning, but really fascinating. I wish I could go back to grad school and become a biologist. It's cool stuff. One theme that will come across in my talk is that, in the field of bioinformatics, biology, all the work that we saw this morning as an example, and my own son is doing his PhD in biophysics. Human health, there's so much at stake. It's a data-rich field. Surprisingly, in the earth science, it's very humbling that there are a lot of systems for which we really don't have a whole lot of data, even in this day and age. And it's hard to collect the data even. That's one of the themes that will come across. Now, how do I get to my presentation? Click one more. Great. Okay. So I'm going to talk today about opportunities for learning from sparse data to advance biogeochemical modeling of mountain watersheds and the response to climate change, which is one of the urgent needs in terms of a question that we are all trying to address and answer. What will these environments look like 10, 20 years from now, or even 2050? And will that imply major changes in what humanity has come to take for granted about resources, water, and other things from them? I also acknowledge contributions from my PhD student, Shenbang Zhong, and Andy Manning at the US Geological Survey in Denver, who is a collaborator on some of this work, and Satish, who helped with some of the modeling work, getting people to work on this. Most of my work on this topic has been supported by the National Science Foundation through the Critical Zone Observatory Network in two sequential projects, and to some extent by the Johns Hopkins University as well. So I'm going to start with some examples of climate change and water quality impacts of climate change in high elevation mountain watersheds. I'll show three examples, and then that provides a context for where I'm going to go in terms of outlining some ideas and addressing the issues in those three sites. So the first is from a high elevation watershed in Rocky Mountain National Park, the Lock Vale watershed. This is work from Jill Barron's group at Colorado State University. This is somewhat, it's above tree line. There's a lot of glaciers, rock glaciers, cryospheric features in this watershed. When we look at the meteorology, the annual air temperatures here between about 1990 and 2010 didn't really show any significant trends. But as you can see, the summer temperatures, definitely there is a systematic increasing trend there. Correspondingly, you can infer that as a result of that, there's a lot of melting going on. The cryospheric features that were embedded in the ice, the ground ice, the glacier ice, and the rock glacier ice was melting out. And some of it is evident in the fact that in some of these years, you're actually getting more water out of these systems than what goes in. It suggests that some water reservoir from inside is being depleted, and that is the cryospheric ice water that is just coming out as melt. Now, when this happens, you're obviously opening up flow pathways in the subsurface. And so correspondingly, what the interesting finding here was that even in this period when the atmospheric nitrogen deposition, which is a bit of a problem in high elevation regions, these alpine ecosystems are very, very delicate, and especially in North America, in the northern hemisphere, you have atmospheric nitrogen deposition that is fertilizing these delicate ecosystems. When you couple that with climate change, some interesting things are going to start happening, and that is, for example, here, even though we have relatively stable nitrogen deposition, there is an increase in stream nitrogen exports from this watershed. And the explanation is that you're basically getting microbial nitrification in these newly thawed sediments. You're creating new subsurface flow paths. This system was frozen and kind of dead, and it's thawing. You're starting to get microbial life going. It's the beginning of coming to life of these high elevation ecosystems. Initiation of biogeochemistry, widely observed in other recently deglaciated terrains in the Alps, and lately even in the Himalayas. So the question is, what's going to happen to these as a result? Will there be some ecological succession that follows these, and suddenly they're all going to transform? Vegetation line will start ascending in these systems. The second example is from a location near Webster Pass in Colorado. The nearest big town is, or nearest town of note is Montezuma. about 12,000 feet elevation, a pair of USGS research watersheds. This is hydrothermally altered granite, very rich in pyrite and some other minerals. It's these systems generate natural acid rock drainage. Without any mining and things like that, they are putting out high solute loads into the streams. And what's interesting is that between 1980s and the 2010s, so 30 years, systematic increasing trends in sulfate and metals. Very, very nice systematic trends. In fact, the zinc concentrations nearly tripled, and the zinc concentrations in these streams now exceeds the aquatic life standards, which wasn't the case in the 1980s. So something is happening. The hypothesis here is that this is because of in this case, it's not because of cryospheric features, even though being at such high altitude. A lot of the water that's coming into these streams is coming through a groundwater flow path. The groundwater is fairly deep, about 70 meters below the ground here. And the hypothesis here is that water table decline because of declining snowpack and recharge, which we know much about from a water resources perspective, that's basically accelerating the oxidation rate of sulfide minerals, thus causing the increase in sulfate and in the metal concentrations. The minerals here are pyrite and sphalerite, which is a zinc iron sulfide. So there is evidence for water table decline, at least during part of this period when they had systematic data. And there's also a sense that the water table and sulfate are inversely correlated, meaning that as the water table is declining, the sulfate is increasing. So there's clear sense that this hypothesis has some justification. The third site is something that may be familiar to those of you who work with the Watersheds SFA from DOE, which is the East River site. This is in shale bedrock. This shale, again, is quite rich in pyrite, carbonates, and inorganic nitrogen also. So at this site, the interesting finding was that a large fraction of the total dissolved nitrogen export is not from soil or atmospheric deposition processes, but from the weathering of the shale itself. And it's in the form of nitrate, so there is nitrification going on in the weathering zone that is in the zone of annual water table fluctuation. Subsequently, that then denitrifies in the hyporeic zone and potentially releases very large, surprisingly large fraction of nitrous oxide. This source of nitrous oxide, which is a potent greenhouse gas, has largely been overlooked in nitrogen budgets in the Earth cycle. In fact, this work from German Wan and co-workers, it was in Nature Geoscience for the Trees, and a very nice paper that shows that this is an important mechanism for releasing nitrous oxide in the atmosphere. So, and again, the question is, what would happen as the climate dries out here? And this story in this type of shale setting is not exclusive. The Mancos Shale is a shale deposit that covers much of the western US, deposited during the late Cretaceous, during the time of the Great Inland North American Sea, the marine shale. And this picture only shows the outcrops. The actual region where you have significant groundwater flows that are coming through this Mancos Shale is much larger. And in many cases, you find concentrations of nitrate and selenium that are quite high, and even in some cases, uranium and some other toxic metals. And in some cases, the delivery of these to this natural contamination, really, not any mining, the delivery of these contaminants to the streams is to some extent facilitated by irrigation return flows in the lower elevations where, away from the mountains where there is agriculture and other things, pasture going on there. So considering all of these questions, not just in the US, but in other countries as well, you have declining snowpacks, shifting snowmelt regimes, reduced recharge, declining water tables. A lot of the climate modeling, hydrology modeling, which is a little bit more accessible, suggests that you're going to get drier conditions and decreasing stream flows in some areas, and some other areas, increasing stream flows. Question is, so what are the implications for water quality and biogeochemical processes? It's hard enough getting climate change projections right and hydrology right. Well, what about these other things? So the nitrogen cycle, the biogeochemical processes, and so on. For example, at the Hancock Gulch, Upper Snake River site, will the trend of increasing solute concentrations be maintained, or are there some process controls that put a break, upper bound on where these things will level off? Are we going to see more nitrate export and nitrous oxide release in drying climate? How can we quantify these? How can we leverage ideas from machine learning and AI to quantify these? That's kind of where I'm going to try and take this discussion. Now let's, for comparison or context, let's look at some other areas in the earth sciences, in hydrology in particular, where machine learning has been put to use. The classical problem of stream flow forecasting. Stream flow forecasting is a big enterprise in hydrology, as you can imagine. Basically, given precipitation time series, tell me how much stream flow is coming out. It's called watershed modeling. It's been around for like 50 years, going back to the era of the so-called Stanford watershed model. The National Weather Service uses these types of models to do your stream flow forecasting, flood forecasting, and so on and so forth. It's a data-rich field, many years of continuous time series data to build these kinds of models. Historically, as I said, for 50 years, models were built that are in this category, process-based hydrologic models. And I mean, to those of us who come from the groundwater side, these are also just emulators. They're a bunch of buckets thrown together. They're not really solving the equations for, surface water and groundwater flow, which those kinds of models are also evolving now. But these types of models have been around for a long time. Again, they're not like perfect, but you can calibrate them to make them produce good predictions. And neural network and ML type models have been developed in two waves. First, in the 1990s, the artificial neural networks, it was popular at that time. And then, like in many other fields, just like the AI winter, there was also sort of this ML winter or neural network winter when it went out of phase in the early part of this century. And now it's had this grand revival again. So in this second phase, recurrent neural networks of the long-term, short-term memory type are quite popular as environments that can produce the same types of predictions as these. So looking at how these models, how these two types of models perform comparison, this very nice set of papers by Razavi and co-workers. If we look at these process-based models, the red line here before, it kind of knows something about the system that, when you have a lot of rainfall, you're going to get a lot of stream flow. It at least knows that. It's off in the timing. And after calibration, of course, you can get it to line up pretty well. The machine learning based models, they're kind of clueless before calibration. When you first start out, they don't even know that more rain means more stream flow. But once you train them and calibrate them, they do pretty well. And in fact, if you look closely, they end up doing better than the process-based models. It's very interesting to note that this Nash Sutcliffe efficiency is actually the highest in the calibration and the validation phase for essentially a agnostic machine learning type modeling framework. And of course, the question is, knowing this, what would I do if I want to predict in a time of non-stationarity? If there are going to be major changes in the way these hydrologic systems are functioning because of climate change and things like that, will these machine learning models that were trained on very high availability data, is that still going to be effective in a time of change? And that's why one concern that even the people in the field have expressed is that the reason why these ML models perform so well is not very well understood. They're not interpretable or explainable. And so there is this effort to try and integrate them better with the process-based models and come up with some kind of a hybrid. And again, wherever there is data, short-term water quality prediction in streams, which, again, like programs like NAQUA, they monitor on a daily basis water quality. You can use those time series to create similarly, forecasting models for stream water quality in some cases. But what about, in a time of non-stationarity, in time of climate change? For example, if you have snow-rain transition resulting from climate change and you have tipping points such as the groundwater stream connection breaks off and the system goes into a completely new regime of functioning, you need some process understanding to be able to predict under those kinds of situations. So can the machine learning frameworks be trained, or can we make them learn functioning process and process controls and predict that way rather than just simply data-driven prediction? And when we look at mountain watersheds and the need to predict water quality and biogeochemical process evolution in these mountain watersheds, it is a very data sparse situation. There's very little data. There's nothing to train on. what tools can we use to produce something that, what I would term as a process-informed machine learning framework to address some of the questions we laid out earlier. For example, if we take that Handcart Gulch of Upper Snake River setting, question I can ask is, well, is the trend in zinc going to continue? Is it going to accelerate? Is it going to level off because of some process controls? For example, if it is oxygen that is limiting the reaction, is there an upper bound to how much oxygen can be supplied to these systems by the natural, Weyler zone and things like that? Okay. There have been attempts to try and predict water quality using machine learning and related tools. Perhaps the first of these long-standing tool from the US Geological Survey called Sparrow. It's a regression-based prediction of solute concentrations in streams based on the watershed characteristics that host these streams. Essentially, regression equations derived from lots of legacy data. The Geological Survey has really been a yeoman service to the country in terms of water and natural resources in a big way. So it's like 50 years worth of data that goes into some of these sometimes. Now, this type of prediction with this regression was really not very accurate in the Mancos Shale, contamination sites that the USGS was working on, mainly because these regression equations work very well when land use is a major influence. When we know whether something is, when the vegetation influence is strong, and you're talking about irrigation versus pasture in lower elevation situations, they work very well. But when you're looking at natural processes in a mountain watershed type setting, they're not actually as effective because they seem to not know something about the deeper subsurface. And more recently, the more modern version of these types of regressions with supervised, unsupervised clustering algorithms from Haruko Wainwright and co. in the East River. They took the East River watershed and they performed a zonation based on hill slopes. They took hill slope characteristics that they thought would be good predictors of water quality, and tried to map out those hill slopes on the East River. They looked at each sub watershed and tried to ask, well, can I find a way to predict water quality variables based on this hill slope zonation? So this also, they have, for example, if you look at the fraction of grassland deciduous area in your watershed, you can make some prediction about nitrate export. So these are useful, that the step in the right direction. And the question is, can you actually represent solute export from these mountain watersheds with significant deep groundwater circulation based on properties that you're more or less inferring that are near surface properties? Okay? You don't know much about, a lot of geology, mineralogical variables are not included there, and yet that's really what the signature of those processes is, what you see in the solute loads coming out of these watersheds. Would they know enough about the deep subsurface biogeochemical system, the deeper parts of the ground? And this is particularly relevant because these base flow periods, when you get a lot of groundwater discharge, are really sensitive for water quality because you have less dilution with less water going through. And it's widely documented, or at least people are, it's not surprising really, but then, typically we thought of mountain systems as snowmelt dominated, that, you think that you have perennial flows because of snowmelt. You forget the fact that a lot of that snowmelt is actually going through groundwater before coming to the stream. In fact, in the upper Colorado Basin, more than half the stream flow actually takes the groundwater flow route. And that changes with elevation. About 40% at high elevations to about 65% at lower elevations is coming through a groundwater route. That means it's undergoing all the geochemical reactions that happen in the deeper subsurface system. And so, for example, at the East River site, the 35% that they estimated there is consistent with this 40% estimate for the basin at large. And similar findings from the Sierra Nevada and very recent studies in the Andes and the Himalayas also corroborate this, that, snowmelt is a great thing in high mountain systems, that you get water eventually coming from snow, but then a lot of it is actually coming through a groundwater flow path. So water quality implications of changes at these high elevations could be quite significant. Okay, so let's just take one example of, trying to ask a question of, can I say something about what might happen, or can I understand what's going on in this Handcart Gulch, Upper Snake River paired watershed system? Suppose that I had hydrologic projections. What would I need to know to project these future water quality trends? In this case, we're actually lucky to have two measurements. In most cases, it'll be zero measurements, but here at least there's two water table measurements, one at the ridge And this is a transect showing a measurement ridge. This is opportunistic transect. It was put there for geochemical mining. I mean, for mining exploration purposes, it's not really a mined watershed, but they were able to use these holes then to do water table measurements, and they have a core left over from that in the ore prospecting days from which they can infer something about the mineralogy. So there's two water table measurements, and from the mineralogy in this core that's on the ridge, you can say that the solute exports are basically coming from weathering of pyrite or sphalerite, and we also know that this is a highly fractured bedrock system from the core. It's a pretty large watershed. It's like 1 kilometer and about 300 meters relief, 100-meter deep groundwater circulation, decent size. So first thing I would need to know is something about the hydrogeologic setting. Typically, the hydraulic conductivity is zonated into a high conductivity region, a low conductivity region. This is highly fractured near the surface where the stress release from the upheaval of the land mass itself. And the fractures typically are sparser as you go deeper, also less permeable. So this certainly exerts some influence on the nature of groundwater circulation. Depending on where this transition is, you could have a lot of shallow circulation, or you could have more deep circulation if the contrast is not as dramatic and things like that. And in this particular case, it turns out that if there is a contrast, it may actually be in the Vero zone, not in the saturated zone. In a case like that, the actual water table prediction from a homogeneous simulation where you assume that the hydraulic conductivity is the same everywhere versus differentiating these two units may not be very different, except that you get a lot more shallow flow when you account for this stratification. So hydrogeology plays a role in how much shallow flow. That's important because if oxidation is the process that is causing the solute loads, oxidation is favored if the water is all circulating at a shallow depth rather than at a deeper depth. And there's all kinds of games you can play with this. In some cases, people speculate that the hydraulic conductivity does not change abruptly, but changes exponentially with depth. You could potentially include all that in some kind of a modeling study. And then there's the question of, what about meter scale heterogeneity? Maybe not a major control, because in a lot of these systems, the overall flow system is really controlled by topography and the fact that water enters here and has to come out of the stream. So that it's hard to break that pattern by heterogeneity unless it's very, very dramatic, in which case you would probably detect it. So then coming to the geochemical variables that you would need to know, mineralogy, geochemical properties, easier said than done. Almost know nothing about this in many, many settings. From the core, we know that there is kind of a weathering front of some sort, that up to some depth, the pyrite is already oxidized, and below some depth, there is still fresh pyrite there. I don't know anything about the weathering front all through here. I have one measurement. I don't know whether it's coming like this or like that or what. Potentially, we could address that question by saying, well, maybe the weathering front started functioning from the end of the last ice age in the Holocene. I could try to make simulations to try and understand where that weathering front is. Yeah, we could do that. Potentially, that could be part of the various menu of things that we need to do to predict what might happen in these systems. This is largely fracture control hydrogeology. One thing we can say with some confidence is that the reactions may not really modify the hydraulic and transport properties so much because it's mostly because of fractures. But very near the stream, there is evidence for a lot of secondary mineral precipitation that clearly may have a role. We don't quite know what that role is yet. We haven't carried out modeling studies that far. And the question is, what is the pyrite? What is the mineral volume fraction? How much mineral is in there? How heterogeneous is it geochemically? Does heterogeneity matter? These kinds of questions, we can ask these questions too. So here's some illustrative simulations of this system done with pFlowTran, which is a reactive transport simulator built in the DOE complex, starting here with Glenn Hammond and several others like Satish who are on the development team. This is really highly simplified geochemistry just for a screening purpose, looking at oxidation of pyrite by oxygen to produce iron 2 sulfate and acidity. With a field scale calibrated rate that Andy Manning was able to fit based on the 1D data from the data at the ridge. It does not include secondary mineral precipitation. It's a baseline simulation that also doesn't consider reoxygenation in the Vero zone, which is really dominant control in this setting, as we'll see in a few minutes. We have basically a flow field that will have a lot of shallow circulating streamlines. still looking at what the sensitivity to this flow field is. This is what the simulations show as far as reactive transport goes. So again, we're simulating a system where we're assuming that this blue region is oxidized, the water table is here, and I have an oxidized region here. Ideally, what I would expect is that you get a lot of pyrite oxidation in this region here, where you have some pyrite to react, and you also have vadose zone, so that there's a lot of oxygen in the environment as well. Typically, what you find in these simulations is that if you look at the dissolved oxygen profiles in the water, most of the oxygen is consumed between the surface and some bottom boundary that really depends on the reaction rate, how much mineral is there, and so on and so forth. So you have this reaction zone where all the action is occurring. And interestingly, if that is the case, then the sulfate concentration should behave in a particular way. That is that, suppose that reaction here is going to completion. And I know how much oxygen I'm supplying to the system. I don't really need to know how much mineral is there, right? That's really what we're seeing here, that sulfate is constant all through here. And what that means is the reaction was finished here as the flow paths were going past that, except for this region near the stream where we are seeing some oxygen that came into the system flushing out. In the rest of the case, all the oxygen is consumed. I can actually calculate by hand what this sulfate must be, right? Assuming that we have an accurate representation of the geochemistry. So in a case like that, it seems that, well, maybe the key thing in these systems is how much oxygen is going in. Okay? This may be true for a system where the water table is deeper, but certainly for a system like the East River, where there's a lot of shallow flow, this chemostatic type assumption may not really work. The question is, the answer is a little more complicated. You have a very high fraction of shallow groundwater flow where this type of non-chemostatic behavior would be important, and then the problem gets a little bit harder. You have to go into the geochemistry and things like that. So again, can a machine learning type framework do this kind of reasoning? If we do a bunch of simulations and ask it to do this kind of reasoning, can we then use these ideas to build a framework for trying to project how these systems may behave and how they may evolve? Okay. We talked about reactivity a little bit. This is a topic that I said we use an empirical reaction rate here. It's well known that when you take laboratory experiments on any geochemical reaction and use the kinetics from that in a field scale model, you basically don't get anything that resembles reality. This disparity between lab scale reaction rates and field scale reaction rates, it's a long-standing conundrum in environmental geochemistry. There are lots of processes that contribute to these disparities, heterogeneity, various intrinsic processes like the modification of the mineral surfaces because of the weathering itself, transport limitations, diffusion limitations, and so on and so forth. And when I was preparing this talk, I was curious, hey, somebody must have looked at this topic using machine learning to see how to resolve this out. And sure enough, I found something from within DOE that actually see John's name on it. Yeah, it looks like it was a white paper of some sort that is a collaboration between Lawrence Berkeley Lab and PNNL. Process discovery through a simulation of complex biogeochemical data sets, one of which is to mine historical information on experiments and try to address topics like this, which is the question of reactivity. Can we get all the data that's out there, legacy of experiments, and try to see what tells us about how to parameterize reactivity in these systems. Another process that happens in these systems is because they're fractured rock, very likely you're having highly preferential advection through connected fractures and matrix diffusion, which regulates the reaction. In a case like that, again, it may be that when you have strong diffusion limitations controlling the overall reaction rate, the mineralogy, the kinetics matter less. The overall reactivity is controlled by diffusion. That's a possibility as well. And then, you can build more complicated chemical models for these systems that in reality, it's not really this reaction. In most natural settings where you get acid rock drainage, the actual reaction that's occurring is the dominant oxidant of pyrite is ferric ion, which is generated by oxidation of ferrous ion in solution by microbes, acidophilic microbes that actually speed up this reaction by 6 orders of magnitude. And these have this interesting pH-dependent metabolism. And you can include the more complete geochemistry with a lot of the aqueous speciation and build a much more complicated model. And yet, in many cases, the field scale predictions are obtained with simpler models that work sufficiently for many operational purposes. So maybe there's a method to the madness there. There is a history of using ideas from nonlinear dynamics, such as low-dimensional manifolds, to simplify chemical reaction networks. It cannot be elegantly done in all settings. The analytical beauty of this manifold theory breaks down when you go to more and more dirty systems. But I think we can use simulations of differential algebraic systems, chemical reaction networks, apply machine learning on top of them to learn simplified reaction networks that you can use to simulate large-scale problems. That's another, I think, opportunity that we could pursue to advance this topic of predicting the biogeochemical response of these systems. Reactive transport modeling is a mature enterprise now, thanks to DOE. There's codes like pflow-trans, STOMP, and all that. And while it is a computationally intensive enterprise compared to regressions or machine learning type clustering type algorithms, in this day and age, with the type of computing resources that DOE has, you can do thousands of 2D hill slope simulations in a week. So that says something. We certainly have the capability to ask what-if questions, create domains where we can run simulations and try to learn from them. So why not go beyond data-based machine learning to process-based machine learning? We have some understanding of how to represent processes in these reactive transport models. Why not just run these large simulation suites and then mine them to generate process understanding, to obtain process-informed machine learning, to understand not prediction, but functioning. Once we get functioning, then we may be able to make projections. So can we use process-informed machine learning to learn, to learn biogeochemical functioning? So here is my sort of dream of what a framework like that might look like. I myself don't do machine learning, but if I had to work with somebody doing machine learning, this is how I would start the conversation. At the core, there is a high-fidelity reactive transport model simulation suite that you can supply with hill slope cross sections with various representations of hydrogeology, hydrostratigraphy, subsurface biogeochemistry, mineralogical properties, things like that, molecular to surface to core to field scale assessments of reactivity, chemical reaction networks and their reduced order abstractions, microbial dynamics. I put double arrows here because using these simulations in a machine learning framework to understand major behavioral regimes and classes. For example, if no matter how hard you push a system, it's always going to be in a chemostatic type condition, then it tells you that, hey, you know what, maybe in the system you don't need to know a lot about the mineralogy. What you really need to know is how much oxygen is going in, focus on that problem, right? So like that, identifying the major behavioral regimes and classes, what causes transitions between these regimes, what are the dominant process controls in each of these regimes, what are the results sensitive to among these, what is the worth of information from all of these different categories, a way to reason all of this from this simulation suite while using some of these classical ideas of non-dimensionalization, n-member analysis that the geochemists have known for a long time. Putting all this together, can we build parsimonious and robust models of mountain watershed hydrobiogeochemical function? In other words, using simulations, high fidelity simulations as a critical ingredient in an engine, learning from them and learning then what information we need. We can't really get a lot of information, but again, that's why I say parsimonious in the end. But at some level, these systems function in ways that cannot be pushed too far from how they're functioning, inherently because of some dominant process control at each site. Can we learn that from machine learning? In the absence of data, can we learn it from simulations? Okay? That is the hope that I have for the future. So let me, that's almost like ML SciDAC. I mean, this DOE had this program called SciDAC earlier, Scientific Discovery Through Advanced Computing. That part is here, essentially combining ML and SciDAC. That would be a viable way of trying to, actually address some of these problems where there's very little data and the first step in understanding the future of these systems is to understand their functioning. So applying machine learning not for database prediction, but to understand functioning. So let me stop there. Thank you so much. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Professor Rajaram. We have time for questions. John.
I'm going to try and formulate this question well, but help me out here, because I think you're going to see where I'm going with this. So you started out by talking about the fact that machine learning works really well when you're not changing the underlying parameters, right? But now as we go into climate change, we're starting to get more and more change, right? So just thinking about what you've been talking about, looking at what you have here, it occurs to me that there's two major types of heterogeneity that are going to be manifest in if you try and take this modeling approach. And the question, I guess, is there a way to get around this with machine learning, right? One is the the importance of the groundwater flow paths in the subsurface, right? Which is actually not, I don't think that's in any of your boxes.
It's the top box, yeah, the first box.
The first one, I see. So you have it in hydraulic transport properties, and those are going to change, right? The flow paths and the amount of discharge through the flow paths are going to change with changing climate, right? The other thing that's going to change, oh, well, let's just leave it at that. I guess the other thing that's changing, I guess, is climate itself, but let's just leave it at that. So if you have this constant change and we don't know enough already about the bedrock geology and the flow paths, et cetera, then is there a way, I can see you can run this many, many times and get lots of simulation outputs, but how do we account for the general lack of knowledge for what's the components is being contributed through deep bedrock flow? Does that make sense? Am I being very clear?
I mean, at some level, high-level geological information should tell you something about the mineralogy, right? So it's not like we're not going to use that. That is in the second box here, right? And the question is, for example, you can ask the question in the opposite way, that how much of a change in the subsurface flow paths would be needed to make enough of a regime change in the solute export behavior? I mean, is there a tipping point? Is there a threshold? Is there a time when I break from a chemostatic type condition or a non-chemostatic condition into a chemostatic condition? So for example, does the notion of a chemostatic condition tell you something about the upper bound, right? If the transitions are always going to, if they push you in a direction where you're going to end up with an upper bound that is controlled by a chemostatic type thing of having a reaction completed within your domain, then there's an upper bound to how much solute you can get out of it, right? I think you can do that kind of reasoning with a machine learning framework thrown over these simulations. And sure enough, these simulations should include those types of perturbations as well. A present day type setting and then future settings. What might you see across, you play what if games essentially, reduce the recharge rate and rerun the simulation, see how much the groundwater flow paths change and what has changed in terms of the export biogeochemistry.
You think that you need to have a pretty well-defined conceptual model for the hydrology then in advance, or is there a generalized way that you think that could be handled?
I think these systems are actually very forgiving in some ways. Let me give you an example, which is that if you look at transit time distributions, which is one way of organizing solute retention and export from a watershed, despite all the complexities, their shapes are reasonable. In some cases, you can fit them with an exponential model. In some cases, with a gamma type model. Those models are quite robust. I mean, the allied question is understanding what's behind the simplicity of those models. But the fundamental nature of hill slope flow, you're actually forgives the heterogeneities. And people who have tried to look at, suppose I populate the subsurface domain with a lot of heterogeneity, how much does the transit time distribution change? It turns out that the hill slope topography is actually the dominant control. The difference in the travel times of streamlines that are originating from near the stream versus on the ridge, that is the dominant control. So that combined with any major stratigraphic interfaces does a pretty good job of capturing the essence of the flow path behavior, meaning that you really don't have to go and sample meter scale heterogeneity to understand what the role of heterogeneity is in these systems. Because unlike in a groundwater remediation type scenario, it's a completely different setting here. It's the organization of the hill slope itself that really is driving a lot of the behavior in these systems.
Thanks.
Thank you. I actually am going to take this schematic that is very complex to a little bit even more complex and apply this to a soil system. And where now the contribution from the microbes and organics that are there are large. And the question is, we don't know all the processes that are happening, let alone to know which one is the dominant. So how can the machine learning help us with this? How do you foresee that?
First, I guess in some ways this is more complicated. In some ways, it's a lot simpler, right? The nice thing about these high elevation mountain systems is that there's not a lot of organic matter, and in that sense, they're simpler than the soil systems. But again, I think you have to create a box, that includes the other controls on how a system might behave. And of course, I think the MODEX type philosophy is the best thing because you're founding it in reality and in experimental data. And the mod part of the MODEX, certainly we can do a lot of what if type modeling, right? And I think that the models and experiments can each teach each other a lot of things. For example, the modeling can help you identify what is the end result sensitive to that you need to put more effort into in trying to resolve from your experiments, right? So I think there is a way to fit that into this framework also. And maybe we can expand it to not just modeling, but a MODEX type yellow banner, right?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great talk. I just want to ask, maybe related to John's question. So we can use machine learning to supplement some of these previous models. We are trying to predict, better predict these single processes or functionings. So when we are looking at the whole system, it's not like this controlled sort of environment called controlled settings where we control everything else and we put perturbation on this thing and see how the response can look like. In a whole system, it might be all related. It's like, how do you make the connections of those different systems, different points? And how do you see the future of these kind of system modeling? How how machine learning can plug into these kind of things? I don't know if that's.
Yeah, these models actually are, you can think of them as coupled process models, right? They do have in them flow, transport, reactions, multi-species reactions also. To that extent, they are a fairly complete description of a suite of biogeochemical processes. So does that answer your question? We're not looking at, if you want, you could look at something in isolation, but you can also broaden these models to basically have, nitrate, other solutes. You can couple the nitrogen and other cycles in this models if you need to. And in fact, maybe in that context, one of the nice things about the pFlowTran architecture is the reaction sandbox, right? It allows you to put reaction networks in there that you can specify as a sort of hypothesis testing type framework, or even to generate a richer suite of simulations from which you can learn.
Yeah, for sure. So what I'm seeing is there's a limit on what we know these processes. We have modeled a lot. We have to do a lot of simulations, monitoring. And there's also things we might not know very well, or we might not monitoring them. We don't have much data of it. And then when we are looking at the whole system, we need to look at everything because they are interrelated.
Absolutely.
So how do you use machine learning to help it, like it's like more like in the future, how do you maybe monitoring or predicting the whole system? Yeah, that's how do you look at this?
Certainly, that is something to keep in mind, the holistic response of the system and looking at, I mean, doing this part in a more holistic way than, I mean, if you have a particular target, it's one thing, but if you want the system as a whole functioning, then you want to take a more holistic view.
So we are almost at time. So maybe a quick question and
It's just looking at
Quick
this,
question.
looking at this sliding here, is your idea to build a surrogate model of the more complicated simulation model?
Surrogate is a good word to use, but I would say reduced order, meaning that you're not taking away some of the features of the processes that are in there.
Yeah.
But you may want to represent them with less fidelity depending on the sensitivities, right? So you might, what you can simplify and what you cannot simplify.
My point is that you can take the simulation data and sort of try to figure it out how you can represent that data with less input parameters. I think that's what you're.
Right.
That's-
Yeah.
okay.
Thank you.